وسهلا بكل الذين ينضموا للاستماع إلى راديو بلدي، أول راديو عربي أمريكي ويعنى بقضايا العرب في المهجر. برامجنا في راديو بلدي كل يوم جمعة من 8 وحتى 9 صباحا مع ليلى الحسيني في بث حي ومباشر وعبر WNZK راديو 690 AM. صباح الخير بلدي، صباح الخير لكل مستمعينا.
Welcome to Radio Baladi, the first Arab, Middle Eastern and American simulcast radio show. Radio Baladi is broadcast every Friday morning on WNZK 690 AM from 8 until 9 Eastern Time on Good Morning Michigan with Layla Al-Husseini. Our call-in number 248-557-3300. And now, stay tuned for the best radio talk show on Arab and American issues with your host, Layla Al-Husseini.
I am Atef Abdel Gawad. Join me the first Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. I will be discussing some of the most important issues and events in the Middle East live on America's Voice of the Arabs. WNZK 690 AM and WDMV 700 AM.
Good morning. The death of a black man at the hands of a white police officer in Minneapolis triggered widespread protests across the country. George Floyd died after the police officer knelt on his neck for 9 minutes, ignoring Mr. Floyd's plea that he can't breathe. 3 other officers stood by, failing to do anything to stop the atrocity. Whether it is an act of racism or not, it is not a single incident. Police officers have long been involved in the killing of black men. There is something wrong in America. But the diversity of the protesters indicate that most Americans are not racist. Black men were killed by the police in mostly black police departments. So the problem must be deeper. What is it and how can it be resolved? In the next hour, we will explore these questions and related issues. We have and we will ask a group of distinguished guests. Dr. Edmund Ghareeb, a scholar and expert on American and Middle East affairs. Mr. Darnell Blackburn, a former police officer and member of the Michigan Commission on Law Enforcement. Mrs. Rhonda Powell, Operations Director for We the People, Michigan, and we will be joined later by Dr. Colin Campbell, a lecturer at Howard University. Now, my first question will go to all my distinguished guests. And the question is, the protest we are seeing across the country, are they over the death of one person, George Floyd, or do we have a deeper problem? And we will start with Mr. Blackburn.
Good morning. Well, the protests are not over one person. The protest is deep-seated. There seems to be a systematic problem with regards to law enforcement and with regards to the relationship with the people of this country. So this goes much further than the death of George Floyd. Unfortunately, he was the person who had to kind of be the martyr to force this to be an issue that we wanted to or have to address because it continues to happen.
Dr. Ghareeb.
Good morning, and I agree with what I just heard. I think the problem is a much deeper problem. It's a much deeper issue. It has various aspects to it. Some of it is historical. It has to do with the position of the African American community and their history in the United States. While there have been a lot of changes that have taken place as a result of the civil rights movement that started in the 50s and the 60s and was led by a number of prominent people. The best known of them, of course, was the Reverend Martin Luther King. And I remember actually when I was still a student, we went to hear him at the college near where I was going to school. And he was very eloquent. He was an amazing person who really was focusing on the need to bring about changes in the United States and to improve the standards of living of the African American community. And also at the same time, he wanted to see more peace within the U.S. He wanted to see opposition to wars and interventions overseas. It was also at that time, at the height of the Vietnam War. And many of the students there were very much impressed with what he was trying to tell them, the message that he was sending to them. And he did, actually. He and his supporters, his colleagues, bring about very significant changes in the United States. We saw people now, for example, there was an end to segregation. That was very, very significant. We began to see more and more African Americans reach positions, high positions in the government and the business community. But nevertheless, this problem still existed. Part of these problems have to do with the history, as I said. Part of it, there has been the discrimination continued to exist in a number of areas, but also a problem that we have seen, and this is what we are talking about today, what happened to George Floyd, which is a symptom of a much deeper problem. I mean, first of all, I think we should recognize that police have killed not only black people, but other people as well, including the majority were white people. Nevertheless, the percentage of black people who have been killed without justification in a number of cases, this is much higher than the rest of the population. The percentage was around something like almost a little less than a third, so that is very significant. Part of the problem, I think, is also while changes have taken place, we have not seen the kind of changes that are needed on the part of government, on the part of police, even though there have been people, every time you see an incident like this, we hear there are protests, sometimes there's violence occurring, there's destruction of property, etc. But at the same time, and we heard promises of change, but the change has not taken place, or not sufficient change has taken place. One of the issues is why does this continue? In part, because of the laws that exist in a number of states, the laws that are on the books that protect, for example, those policemen who probably and most likely do not represent all policemen. But they are violating basic human rights of individuals, and are, as we saw in this case, this man was accused of writing a check for about $20, and this is then getting this result. So the laws which need to hold those individuals responsible are not there on the books. And this, unfortunately, we did not see either Republicans or Democrats doing enough in this area over the past decade. The second thing is that, and this is probably we could like to hear from your guests, other guests as well, is that unfortunately less and less policemen are coming from the communities they are supposed to protect. They do not understand the community. They do not usually live in that community, and that is also a problem. There is a gap between them, and that is an issue that I think also needs to be done. The third question that I think is very important when it comes to the police also is the question of training. I think there is a need to train policemen to deal humanely and fairly and with U.S. citizens and non-citizens as well, regardless of who the person is. And that is another issue that I think there is a need. Unless some of these steps are taken, we're going to have problems. The other issue has to do with inequality when it comes to areas dealing with, for example, with education, dealing with housing, dealing with healthcare, dealing with jobs. These are also very important issues. That's why we find that in many of the African communities, and especially in some of the larger cities, you have this gap between blacks and whites. Even take example, what we saw in Minnesota, for example. Minnesota is, generally speaking, a liberal state, one of the more liberal states. It was the state that sent the first black Muslim American Congress. Keith Ellison, who happens to be the Secretary also of Justice right now, the Attorney General of Minnesota, and he's now the one who's in charge of the investigation of the case of Floyd. At the same time, the mayor of Minneapolis, the mayor of its Twin City are also African Americans. The fact that you also have a woman who was of Somali origin, Ilhan Omar, who is now a congresswoman from Minnesota. Yet, while these are very important and significant steps, nevertheless, you have to take into account the fact that, for example, about the average family income of white family is about a little over $80,000, while black family is about $38,000. Over 70% of the people in that area own, white people own their homes, while something like 35 or 36%, from what I understand, are black people who own their own homes. So there are also these problems that are facing the community.
Mrs. Rhonda Powell, the question is, are the protests over the death of one person, or do we have a deeper problem?
Good morning. No, I think that this issue of enmity between police officers and the black community is as old as America itself. And unfortunately, we see this problem. Now we are able to see video of the issues. And so it seems like it's becoming more prevalent. But in fact, it is not more prevalent. The images that we see coming across the television, really, they harken back to just the heinous murders of young black boys and girls, even as recent as the 50s. I mean, the mother of Emmett Till was, it's still very, very vivid in my mind, the image on the front of the cover of Ebony magazine, where she made the decision to have an open casket to show, just how her son was brutally murdered, and even though it was a mob of community, people, white men in the community, the police stood by and, were active, they did not keep them safe. So it was done with the permission. So unfortunately, I believe there is still too much of the history of policing, which evolved largely out of slave patrols, and that mindset is still too prevalent. Now, I dare not suggest that we have not made any progress, but when you're talking about the lives of individuals, you're talking about not just policing, we see this mentality in every aspect, which, your other guests just alluded to. It's not just in policing. It is in our education system. It is in our helping institutions, our departments of human services, our public health. It is in every aspect, our economics. So it is in every aspect of the lives of Black people across this country. So while we see it playing out most vividly in policing, it is a much deeper issue in this country.
When we come back after the break, I will ask Mr. Blackburn if he agrees with Dr. Ghareeb that the police doesn't understand the community. After the break.
When it comes to reproductive medicine, IVF Michigan Fertility Centers are the recognized leaders. With locations in Bloomfield Hills and 5 other cities in Michigan and Ohio, IVF has experts in all aspects of the field. As a founding member of IVF Michigan Fertility Centers, Dr. Nicholas Shama is one of the leading reproductive endocrinologists in Michigan and Ohio. Dr. Shama has performed over 10,000 IVF cases and has helped thousands of couples fulfill their dreams of parenthood. American board certified in both obstetrics and gynecology and reproductive endocrinology and infertility, Dr. Nicholas Shama is a very caring, compassionate, expert physician that understands not only the medical but also the emotional toil of infertility on his patients. When it's time, get personalized care from Dr. Nicholas Shama at IVF Michigan Fertility Centers in Michigan and Ohio. Call toll-free 855-952-9600, 855-952-9600.
If halal is important to your family, you can trust that Miramar will offer not only the highest quality halal products, but the best tasting and healthiest foods that can be placed on your family table with confidence. Miramar is the first and oldest halal certified food brand in America, serving the Arab and Muslim community, and offers a wide range of halal food products. Check out Miramar's halal food selection today by visiting Miramar's exclusive distributor, Ziad Brothers Importing at www.ziad.com.
I am Atef Abdel Gawad. Join me the first Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. I will be discussing some of the most important issues and events in the Middle East live on America's Voice of the Arabs. WNZK 690 AM and WDMV 700 AM.
Welcome back to our discussion on Radio Baladi. We are talking about racial problems in the U.S. And my question now is for Mr. Blackburn. As you heard, Mr. Blackburn, Dr. Ghareeb, a few minutes ago said that the police don't understand the community. Do you agree?
Dr. Gawad, I do agree to a certain extent. One of the things that's a huge challenge is for police officers who look like the communities they serve to want to work in the communities. I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have in this country is that there are not enough brown and black police officers or Arabic-speaking police officers, for that matter, or nationalities. Most of the police officers in this country are white males, and most of the white males don't come from these larger urban communities. They come from the suburban communities, yet they work in these urban communities. So they don't understand that if a crowd of African Americans, black folks are together, that they may talk louder, they may be more expressive. Sometimes they think of that as being aggressive as opposed to understanding that that's just how they communicate. So I think one of the biggest things or challenges is getting people in the community to work for police agencies. If we could recruit more diversity, more people of color to work in these communities, not just the urban communities, but the suburban communities for that matter as well, I think that they would step up and step in, and they wouldn't allow a lot of the atrocities that occur to occur in this country.
Mr. Dr. Ghareeb, I know you have to leave us in a few minutes. That's why I have a couple of questions for you before you go. One question is, many people overseas say America is racist? Is it?
That's a very good question and a very difficult question. But let me, before, if I may, comment briefly on what Mr. Blackburn said. I think he's absolutely right. I think there should be more people from the community who police that community, who understand the community, who have relations with that community, who have roots in that community. I think that would make things much. It's not going to solve all problems. There is human nature as well. But this is something that's very significant. I think that's one of the changes, one of the reforms that need to be taken place instead of bringing people from outside. Another interesting thing, I was listening to C-SPAN this morning. There was a black woman who was complaining she was beaten 30 times by police. She said she was beaten by white policemen and black policemen as well. And her problems were, she tried to complain about it and reach of politicians, and while sometimes she received some attention, that she didn't feel that the issues were resolved. She's an older woman, and apparently this happened over a number of years, a number of times. So I think that is very important to have people who understand that community. Also, perhaps with more and more, and would be interesting to hear what Mr. Blackburn would say on this as well, is that perhaps the police control of the police should also be from the community. Each community should have its own board and the people who are running the police, in addition to the reforms that need to take place in terms of the laws. And also there's been an increasing tendency of militarization of police, and that, I think, also may be giving them even weapons of war, not weapons of, and that may itself create another problem, but I don't want to go there. But the point is that the U.S. is a racist country. Look, the racism exists. Unfortunately, it's part of human nature. It's here. It's in other places all over the world. I was listening to a professor at Howard University who does work on Africa. He's an African American. He said he did research in Africa. He said you find it was in Kenya, for example. You find some tribe that has a perspective of they discriminate against another tribe. You see sometimes this. So human nature is there. Nevertheless, there's also a history in this country, the history of slavery also, that is very, very important. That cannot, because it has affected, and while many changes have taken place, there are still some problems that exist and that need to be dealt with. But I think what I've seen over the past few days, you see a response from people from different ethnic backgrounds who are very much concerned about what has happened and what in the past, and that they do not want to see a repeat of what we have seen. And therefore, there's a need for people to work across communities as well, and people from different ethnic groups, different races. And I think the country has gone a long way. Nevertheless, there is still need for change. There is need for reform. And this is something that's also not well understood overseas. I mean, that's a part that sometimes you hear countries, of course, the U.S. has always been that American dream. That's why the U.S. has attracted people from many different countries all over the world. Nevertheless, you also have stereotyped images, as you have sometimes stereotyped images here of people overseas, including, for example, since you focus a lot on the Arab people of Arab origin, there's been a lot of discrimination there. There's a lot of stereotyping of Arabs and Arab Americans. Nevertheless, I think there has been significant changes, but the change is still needed. What we have seen should not be occurring in a country where a government is a government of law and not government of people.
Dr. Ghareeb, I have one more question before I let you go. And briefly, please, do you believe that President Trump should share the blame and the rise of racism in this country?
It didn't start with President Trump, and I don't think it will end with him. But I think some of the language that he has used, some of the way he has spoken, may have contributed to the widening of this rift that exists. But as I said, the problems are deeper, and they were there before him. The people who were there before him didn't solve these problems either, didn't do enough to solve them, and he needs to do more. He needs to reach out to not to the American people as a whole, but certainly to the African American community. And I think there are more efforts should be done. For example, he has spoken of the fact that he said he has, because a result of his economic policies, more African Americans, more Asian Americans, more Hispanic, Latino Americans have gotten jobs than ever before. Yet, I think there is more of a need also to deal with the other issues. So, on the one hand, he may have contributed with the way he has spoken and he has behaved. Nevertheless, I think the issue is deeper than him.
Dr. Edmund Ghareeb, thank you very much for joining us, and we will be back after the break.
Thank you.
Life is a nonprofit charity that's provided humanitarian aid and development to people and communities for over 25 years, regardless of race, color, religion, or cultural background. When disaster occurs here or around the world, Life for Relief and Development rushes in to provide food, medical aid, and shelter to those in need. Please help improve these efforts. Make your tax-deductible donation to Life now at lifeusa.org or call 248-424-7493.
مركز طب رهاب للعلاج الطبيعي بإدارة الدكتور محمد فرح حسين، أخصائي العلاج الطبيعي بخبرة أكثر من 13 عاما. طب رهاب يقدم خدمات العلاج الطبيعي وإعادة التأهيل، ويضم مجموعة من أفضل أخصائي التشخيص الدقيق للحالات المرضية، مع خبرة عالية في التعامل مع الحالات التي تحتاج إلى إعادة تأهيل وعناية خاصة بعد العمليات والكسور. طب رهاب يستقبل كل الحالات المتعلقة بألم الرقبة، الظهر، المفاصل، شلل الوجه، الانزلاق الغضروفي، عرق النساء، الحوادث وإصابات العمل. خبيرات في المعالجة النسائية لخصوصيات تامة للسيدات. عندما تبحثون عن رعاية متميزة اقصدوا توب ريهاب للعلاج الطبيعي، الواقع على 15001 ميشيغان افنيو، وللمواعيد اتصلوا على 313-846-0555. That's 846-0555.
When you're looking for the best in optical care, Dr. Imad Nakash is your doctor to see. With years of experience and thousands of successful procedures performed, you can trust your eyes to Dr. Imad Nakash. See Dr. Imad Nakash and his professional staff for your eye care needs. There's 2 locations to serve you. In Hazel Park, call 248-336-3937. 248-336-3937. In Rochester Hills, call 248-299-3937. That's 248-299-3937.
I am Atef Abdel Gawad. Join me the first Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. I will be discussing some of the most important issues and events in the Middle East live on America's Voice of the Arabs. WNZK 690 AM and WDMV 700 AM.
Welcome back to Radio Baladi. We are discussing racial problems in the country, and Dr. Colin Campbell just joined us. He is professor at Howard University. Dr. Campbell, my question is the question that I asked my panel of guests at the start of this program. The protests that we are witnessing now, are they over the death of one person, or do we have a deeper problem?
I think that the death of one person is always unfortunate. Of course, we know that this isn't just the culmination of one person, any progress or any attention that we're getting, because we have to be careful to see or evaluate things as progress when there really hasn't been a direct result. Having a group of police officers be charged in the death of a man is right now just getting attention. There hasn't really been any policy that has been put in place or changed as a result of George Floyd's death. But this is a culmination over decades of disparity, decades of police brutality incidents, decades of police aggression, decades of death, quite frankly. And so to really look at this issue and see if whether or not there is progress is to see if there is any comprehensive policy that has come out of this, if there are any changes, if there's a way that in the future these deaths are actually prevented, and we don't see scenarios like this anymore. This is not to ignore some of the people that have come out, or many of the people who have come out in protest of what happened to George Floyd. We see a more diverse group of protesters around the world. I mean, it's amazing to see how so many people have galvanized about this one event, even though they're not living in the same country, from London to Amsterdam to Germany and other places around the world. And of course, we see it swept the United States of America with so many people protesting. So in that way, there has been a change, but is there truly progress? And that remains to be seen.
Mrs. Powell, as you heard, Dr. Campbell was talking about diverse groups of protesters. And my question is, are the diversity, or is the diversity an indication that we have now a new generation that is different from previous generation when it comes to racism?
Yes, with this newer generation, we're seeing a more intercultural exchange. They are more white, they're more Latino, more Asian. The protesters that we saw in this country and other countries, the ethnicities were across the spectrum. And that is slightly different than what we've seen in the past. There seems to be a more profound understanding of the racial issues and why they're problematic to cultural development or the ethos of the country. Where you see a white teenager crying because she wants to disown her parents because her parents seem to have no empathy or sympathy for the death of George Floyd, and how public that was, that disownership of her parents or feeling upset with her parents. That was she made that a very public thing. And I think that's something that we hadn't seen before. Part of the reason of this, I believe, is due to social media. Social media, of course, has been a digital platform, a digital space that we didn't see or didn't have, frankly, during the civil rights movement and other movements before that time. And I think the promise of social media added to the outreach of what had happened. It inspired outrage even from people who did not share the same ethnicity or culture as George Floyd. But it helped to unite people around something that they found so viscerally disturbing that they wanted to make their own changes. They wanted to speak out about it. And that's why we're seeing people from the white community, people from the Latino community, from other ethnicities, the Asian communities, helping out African Americans to voice years and years of injustices at the hands of police.
Mrs. Rhonda Powell, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. Do you see any differences in police behavior from one state to the other?
No, and I'd like to just touch on the question as well that you initially posed to me. I do see a difference in, I think, folks waking up. I think that our children, younger folks have grown up in a very global society and have a very different worldview. So many of them, I know I have, children that are in their early 20s, and they have a very different perspective on the world. But I think that history is repeating itself. When you look back historically and you see when these heinous acts of brutality are viewed publicly, I mean, I go back to Mamie Till when she had had Emmett Till's casket open. It sparked outrage. That was a very big part of the impetus to the civil rights movement. The march on the Pettus Bridge. So, I mean, when the country sees this type of brutality, then I think that historically there has been a response. But I believe this is the generation that also is not willing to just march and go home. This is the generation, and the outrage that has been sparked globally is, I think, on the heels of this pandemic, when you're also seeing, inequity play out in healthcare and access to hospitals and adequate care. When you're seeing that, it's the timing as well, I believe, that people are responding to, because people are starting to realize it's not just one area. Now, as far as the difference in policing from state to state, I mean, I certainly would defer to my colleague, Mr. Blackburn. He would know that better. But I think that, unfortunately, so many of these practices are just across the United States. And it harkens back to the history of how policing was started in this country. So we've never fully been able to shed ourselves of really the deep-seated beliefs in many people in this country and fears that, Black people are inherently violent or need to be patrolled, or unfortunately, there's still too much of that. And, a lot of the junk science that has fueled that kind of thinking, you can still find it. So I think just we need to do a lot more. These systems that are in place, whether it's policing, other government systems, healthcare, public health, we've seen inequities play out year after year, and they continue, and even in our prison system. So we need to stop trying to tweak systems that need to be dismantled and really have a true groundswell of citizens that are willing to be the architects of a country that they want to see.
Mr. Blackburn, the question comes to you. Do you see any difference in police behavior from one state to another?
Not really, Dr. Gawad. Obviously, every state has their own the culture, their own kind of individuality. But the reality is that policing in this country was all started the same. And I would agree with Ms. Powell on the concept. It's really, a mindset or a thought process. Police departments are supposed to be paramilitary organizations, meaning that they're not completely militaristic, but they have the premise of such. And I think in that regard, because that's the way the system was set up, that they have become more militaristic than paramilitaristic. So I think, the foundation is laid. Every police officer is trained a certain way, and it creates a certain mentality that crosses, state lines.
Dr. Campbell, when we talk about the need for reform, do you think the reform should come from the top, like through legislation in the U.S. Congress, or are we talking about reform at the state level? Because as we know, the police doesn't follow federal control. It's a state institution.
That's right. And that's why it needs to be a multi-collaborative effort. It needs to be multifaceted. It can't just be federal. It can't just be state. There can be some guidelines and some national recommendations and laws and regulations that can be put in place, such as possibly banning the chokehold that we've seen so many people lose their life over, or not using their knee in the necks of people who are being arrested. That could be something that is nationally regulated. But at the state level, there are so many different things that can be done, from just the way that police approach citizens, their policing policy, the way that they interact with the community. There have been talks where some have suggested that instead of being called police officers, they should be called peace officers, therefore trying to change the very fundamental culture of the police organization, instead of one that has been increasing more antagonistic or more combative with the community that it's supposed to, quote, protect and serve. Instead of that, they should be ready to try to de-escalate as one of the core actions that they have to do when they approach a scene, thinking about how they can ameliorate a situation rather than just incarcerate someone, or rather than oppressing them or battering them, just changing the way that things are done. There has been controversy in the state of Florida when they used to use pictures, and I'm not even sure if they still do or not, but very recently there was a row over the pictures that they use for target practice. Some of the pictures that they used in the target range, in the shooting range, were pictures of black men that they were shooting at. Like, there are those even small changes where the state could say, listen, we don't want that. That's, if you're going to set up paper for target practice, it should be a target, not of someone's face, where you start to build an association, a sight recognition association of people that you should be shooting versus not shooting. I mean, even simple things like that. When it comes to arrests of children, we've seen in some states where black children are being put in handcuffs because they have a verbal altercation with their teacher, or they're being obstinate, or they're having a temper tantrum. How many times have we seen children of various ethnicities have temper tantrums, but yet it still seems to be young black children that are being put in handcuffs and sometimes taken down to the police station because of a temper tantrum in the classroom. So I know that what I'm talking about here is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are just indications that there are much deeper problems that we can address, not just at the federal level, but at the state level as well. And some of these issues would be inspired by the bottom up, in a grassroots way. Parents, teachers, regular citizenry can inspire some of these changes that should be taken at the state level, and the government, the federal level, should do its part as well.
When we come back from the break, I will ask Mr. Blackburn to comment on what Dr. Campbell just said. He's suggesting we call the police officers peace officers. Now, I want to ask Mr. Blackburn how the police get trained after the break.
Life is a nonprofit charity that's provided humanitarian aid and development to people and communities for over 25 years, regardless of race, color, religion, or cultural background. When disaster occurs here or around the world, Life for Relief and Development rushes in to provide food, medical aid, and shelter to those in need. Please help improve these efforts. Make your tax-deductible donation to Life now at lifeusa.org or call 248-424-7493.
If halal is important to your family, you can trust that Miramar will offer not only the highest quality halal products, but the best tasting and healthiest foods that can be placed on your family table with confidence. Miramar is the first and oldest halal certified food brand in America, serving the Arab and Muslim community, and offers a wide range of halal food products. Check out Miramar's halal food selection today by visiting Miramar's exclusive distributor, Ziad Brothers Importing, at www.ziad.com.
Are you going to start a restaurant or grocery store soon? Do you need floor plans and designs? Call Naji Abood at 734-744-9796. Do you want to buy kitchen and restaurant equipment at discount prices? Call Naji Abood now, 734-744-9796. New Concept Products and Design, the trademark of kitchen equipment. 5% discount on all purchases of $75,000 or more. New Concept Products and Design, new location, 31185 Schoolcraft in Livonia. Learn more at www.newconceptproducts.com. Call Naji Abood, 734-744-9796.
I am Atef Abdel Gawad. Join me the first Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. I will be discussing some of the most important issues and events in the Middle East live on America's Voice of the Arabs. WNZK 690 AM and WDMV 700 AM.
Racial problems in the country, and I will ask Mr. Blackburn, Darnell Blackburn. Mr. Blackburn, as a police officer, former police officer yourself, when people talk about police brutality or racism, why do the police act the way they do? Like, for example, what I'm specifically referring to is, as we have witnessed, a white police officer is placing his knee on a black person's neck. So my question is it an acceptable or an institutionalized method or means of training or practice by the police?
Dr. Gawad, absolutely not. There is, in this particular case, and I happen to work full-time for the state licensing agency in Michigan that certifies police officers. So that's what we are the agency that does creates the curriculum. In that situation, that is what we would call a lethal force situation when someone restricts an airway to the neck. When Mr. Floyd was already in handcuffs, already subdued and not a threat, there was absolutely no reason for him to be for the officer to have his knee on his neck in that position. So to speak directly to that, this particular incident, I can tell you as a former officer, as a person still working in law enforcement, it enraged me. I was frustrated, upset, angry, and I'm still frustrated, upset, and angry about this. And as a black man, I'm even more angry. You know, in the training, the thing that's difficult is we, in law enforcement, it's hard to determine what people's biases are in their psyche, in their thought processes. And I can tell you, as I watched that officer, I won't even call him a police officer, the man who killed George Floyd, I looked at his face, I watched that situation. It took me back to the scenes of lynchings in America back in the 50s and the 40s. I saw it was a common day lynching, and the other officers were complicit because they failed to act to help a man that was in distress when they're supposed to be policing. So it's definitely an institutionalized thing. And you know, I don't know what we can do to make a determination as to who has what biases, but we got to change this system some way.
Mrs. Rhonda Powell, do you think that other problems like the pervasiveness of firearms in the American society is contributing to the racial problem?
I absolutely do. I mean, we've never really reconciled with this country's original sin. And I think so many people have a difficult time even talking about, the history of slavery in this country. But what we've done is I personally think, to go back, that, when we should have done more to more than just in slavery. We needed to go beyond emancipation, and we needed to outlaw many more things and set the record straight. But we did not do that, and we're still trying to deal with those, the institutions where the continued beliefs about black people are still prevalent. Our education system made black skin inferior. Science decided that black minds were not as smart. Public health made black bodies lab rats. Healthcare determined that black people didn't feel pain as much as anyone else. Policing made black people dangerous. So, I can go on and on about the institutions and the messaging that is still a subtle part of that we get right now. It's why the rest of the world struggles with racism as well, and, to see black people as inferior because of many of the things instituted in this country. So the problem is far beyond policing, but the question is now, who is it that polices government? Because these are all the institutions where these ideologies were sanctioned, and they still continue to this day. So from one administration to the next, we see changes, even with the militarization of local police departments. Well, we saw in 2015 where, that started in the 90s, but we saw in 2015 where President Obama started to roll those things back. But in 2017, this current president, he rescinded those limitations. So it's got to go beyond just one administration. It has to be the people, the citizens of this country, really standing up and saying, this is not the America we want.
Dr. Colin Campbell. So there is a need for all the people to do something about the problem. My question is, does the black community share the blame in what is happening to the black community?
And what do you mean by what is happening in the black community as far as policing is concerned, as far as relationships with the police department? Just a little clarification on that question.
Just the question is really about the behavior in some elements within the black community. Like, for example, do they share in the blame of using drugs, carrying firearms? Are they contributing to creating the stereotypes that the police have about them?
I would say no. I think that stereotyping and racism in our country runs way deeper than the phenomenon, the drug surge of the 80s that has lingered into the 21st century. There's been a long history of racism and stereotyping and prejudice coming from a white hegemonic structure in the United States. And of course, we know as we talk about America's original sin, which really started with Native Americans, but then was further exacerbated and augmented when it was incorporated into the transatlantic slave trade, and then has carried on from there. And if you really wanted to address some of the stereotyping and racism, we have to go back and look at American history and address that. Now, it's undoubted that there is crime in black communities, there's crime in white communities, there's crime in Asian communities, there's crime in Latino communities. And a lot of the crime that is committed within these communities is intra-racial. It's because it's very geographic, it's locational. So if there's if crime happens, chances are it's going to happen within your ethnicity. Now, why is that? because of the way that America was structured due to redlining, zoning, plain discrimination. There is a way that America has been set up residentially where you have groupings of people. And that was due to racism. That was due to exclusion. That was due to prejudice. So that was a system also set up by white Americans, by people who came here and were the dominant power structure at the top of that hierarchical structure. They set those systems up. So really, when you think about the scourge of drugs or maybe guns, even in various communities, one has to really interrogate what is the true root of this. Yes, there's crime, but where did the drugs come from? Where did the guns come from? How do guns continually perpetuate in various communities? If we are a country that can send people to the moon and create all of this attention to solving global issues, so that because we're supposed to be some type of paradigm for the world, why can't we stop drugs or guns from happening in various communities and neighborhoods? And I think that, again, we can look back on the neglect of the Black community, or the dismissiveness of the Black community, where a lot of these problems occur. I also believe that you do hear ownership. You hear ownership when crimes do occur. You hear angry parents. You hear community leaders saying that there needs to be a change. But unless there is a collective sense of urgency and addressing various problems, they will continue, because it is not just the Black community doesn't just create these problems on its own. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. And it never has. There's been a history of this, and I think that this incident alone is helping to bring more attention to it. But again, as I began this interview, will it bring change? We have to wait and see. We have to push for it to see if that happens. It would be unfortunate that what happened to George Floyd doesn't address some of these more profound issues that are never really addressed in American culture.
Mr. Blackburn, we have less than a minute, and I want to ask you, how do you assess President Trump's handling of the protests?
He doesn't. He does. He is not handling it well at all. If to act like it doesn't exist, or to act as if it barely exists, is to act as if it doesn't exist. And that's all I'll say about that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Darnell Blackburn. I also would like to thank Dr. Colin Campbell, also Mrs. Rhonda Powell, for joining us in this important discussion. And I will see you again the first Friday next month. Have a good and safe weekend.